This is my 10th year, you guys. Very exciting. Woo, we're going to have a party in September. I want to thank you all for being the timely folks. I think I've heard that there were some slowdowns on the metro, so my intro will allow time for some cool folks to walk in. I want to thank you for coming to our meeting today, which is co-sponsored by the China Environment Forum, the Global Health Initiative, and the Environmental Change Security Program here at the Wilson Center. Well, I said I've been here 10 years. The program's China Environment Forum's been around for about 12, bringing together government, NGO, business, and research types around the world, focused on China's energy and environmental issues. And for the past 3 years, we've been really lucky to have a grant from USAID for a project called the China Environmental Health Project, which has really helped kind of, I don't know, invigorate my work here, that we've really been working in our publications and our meetings to bring more of a health perspective, to get the environmental folks to really think about the health linkage with their work. And sometimes I have speakers who have to really kind of nudge them hard to say, come on, think something that you do related to health. Today, I don't think there'll be any nudging necessary. Got a trio here of, these are true environmental health experts. But they're not ivory tower kind of do research and don't go down to the masses type folks. These are people who actually go out into the field and are doing very applied environmental health research. And obviously, since this is the China Environment Forum, these folks have a strong focus on China. You have the bios, so I'm not going to read them blah, 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 as sometimes may happen in this town. But I just wanted to give you just kind of the overall view that we are going to try to help you all kind of get an understanding of some of the on-the-ground work on environmental health that's being undertaken, in great part led by HEI, but also the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. How could I forget Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton? Oh, yeah, I know. I get confused. People always think that I'm at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Very excited to meet you finally, someone from that school. So we're going to move from talking about the research environmental health impacts from pollution in China, and then also have a conversation about also the co-benefits idea, that the fact that air pollution is linked to climate change, right, and health impacts, linking those all together. First, Robert O'Keefe, who is Vice President of the Health Effects Institute, he's going to lay the groundwork of our talk, talking about the work that I consider unique nonprofit organization in Boston is doing, focused on air pollution and health in Asia. And you should know that prior to HEI, he served for 9 years at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, where he did some, I guess, evidently very impressive work on helping to pass Massachusetts state Superfund law. He's going to lay the groundwork for Dr. Junfeng Zhang, goes by Jim, who's going to talk about his work, environmental health studies that were done in Beijing, running up to, during, and I think even after the Beijing Olympics, correct? Yes. Yep. So just because Beijing Olympics was last year, it's not old news, you guys. It's kind of important. There's still people in Beijing who have to breathe every day, okay? And we should be interested not only in those Olympic athletes that were there, but the health of people that continue to live in Beijing. Dr. Zhang is Associate Dean for Global Public Health at the School of Public Health at the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey, where he also is a professor in the environmental occupational health, and somehow he still finds time to do laboratory and field work seemingly all around the world, a lot of it in Asia. So again, he's going to talk about the Beijing. And then we're going to move over to Denise Mazeral, who, as I mentioned, was from that Woodrow Wilson. I've never met someone from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, so it's very exciting for me today. So, it's a hard-hitting school of public and international affairs, and she's an associate professor of environmental engineering and international affairs in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. You guys have the longest. Yeah, we have the longest. Bob's rocks because he's short. Title there, but what's notable? There's a lot of notable things on her bio, but I like noting that she was a contributor to the IPCC panel that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. It was a whole group of you, which I think is kind of a couple thousand. But I think that's cool. You got a nice little slice of Nobel Peace Prize fairy dust on you. So I'm going to stop talking before I say anything any sillier. But I want you to know that while these guys, these are health researchers, they promised me that they're not going to get too technical to terrify you. But at the same time, I told them that you all are a very informed and intelligent audience that don't mind being pushed a little bit outside your comfort zone, because we all need to understand these kinds of trends and issues. So, Bob, before I get any sillier, it's you. Are you going to stand up and talk?
I am.
Okay.
Excuse me. Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Wilson Center for making this forum possible and inviting Jim, Denise, and I to present a little bit. We're going to talk today, I'm going to tell you a couple stories, I think, that deal with local issues in China more broadly, nationally, I guess, at the national level, but then focus in particular on issues in Beijing, and then move out a little bit more broadly to co-benefits and air pollution and climate change. The particular overview of our talk today, I'll start with public health and air pollution in Asia. It's the story of PAPA, public health and air pollution, is an acronym. You need to have an acronym to do business in Europe or in Asia these days, and this has worked well for us. We've been criticized for not having a MAMA, but PAPA so far it may be coming. And this is about representative studies of air pollution and health in Asia, designed to demonstrate the relevance of global science to Asia and to drive policy there based on local interests. That's a theme that really permeates this talk. Also, Jim will talk about the health impacts of regulatory interventions, otherwise known as accountability, an unfortunate title. But it really deals with assessing whether or not regulations work or other major interventions work, and if so, what the health effects are. And in particular, he'll focus on the lessons of reduction measures taken during the Beijing Olympics in terms of lessons learned and motivation for future action. And Denise will sort of draw the pieces together, building on the two health talks, and talk about the intersection of climate change and health in Asia in particular, and co-benefit opportunities to address both greenhouse gases and traditional air pollutants, with a focus on new work she's done recently and published on black carbon. It's a little bit of a busy slide, but it's just why co-benefits? The basic concept here is that air pollution and greenhouse gases are often emitted by the same sources, and reduction measures taken to address one category emission can have an effect on the other. Some of the traditional pollutants, quote unquote, the air pollutants that are put in place because of health, are also, they can increase radiative forcing or warming, or actually can tend to cool it. Ozone and black carbon and sulfates and organic aerosols being two examples. There are benefits, of course, from reducing greenhouse gases, but part of the calculus here is that those can seem very distant and nonspecific to many, especially developing countries, relative to near-term interests. Of course, that's never a problem in the United States. However, when one takes into account actions taken to reduce traditional air pollutants, such as PM and ozone, that can produce near-term health benefits in local populations with very good cost-benefit numbers, and avoided health impacts, you can create a joint incentive to reduce traditional air pollutants as a key step to enable the reduction of greenhouse gases as well. So that's the theory here. Word about HEI, we were founded in 1980. We provide impartial and high-quality science on the health effects of air pollution. We're unusual in that we're jointly and equally funded by US EPA and the worldwide vehicle industry to take money off the table as a source of bias. We also have partnerships with the World Health Organization, the Asian Development Bank, lots of other acronyms in Asia that you're mostly familiar with, as well as other industry and foundation sources. All our research is overseen by independent science committees without relationships to our sponsors. And we do lots of work around the world on key pollutants, particulate matter, ozone, NO2, diesel, those types of things. And we try to make our work relevant to regulatory questions. Important thing about HEI is that we evaluate the science and we don't take or recommend policy positions. A little bit of an example of our studies worldwide. Most of our work's concentrated in North America, as you can see, but we have a significant portfolio in Europe and in Asia and Latin America. So shifting to Asia. So why is there a problem here? One of the illustrations of the problem is this graph from the World Health Organization, from the World Health Organization, depicting average annual PM concentrations or particulate matter around the world. And Asia, perhaps not surprisingly, the emissions in Asia are indeed at the highest end of this chart. This is the air quality, the WHO air quality guideline. It's quite stringent for a PM10 guideline, slightly more stringent than EPA. And these are interim targets, when you see T1, T2, T3, that when the WHO established this very stringent PM10 standard, they felt like it would be too much of a stretch for particularly developing countries that were way up here to say, well, gee, we need to get here. So they established some interim targets that they might achieve along the way. But the main issue here, and this, you'll see Beijing here, you'll see these are Chinese cities on the left side, you'll see cities in India and Kathmandu. Not surprisingly, Asia is the home of the most deaths attributed to urban PM are in Asia. This is the WHO 2006 Global Burden of Disease Estimate. This was an exercise where WHO looked at a whole range of risks around the world, including AIDS, including infectious disease, including waterborne disease, and along the way calculated the global burden of disease from outdoor air pollution. And this is actually in cities, and the circle charts, one is India. These are WHO regions along the bottom. This is India, this is China. You can see that China is well over 300,000 deaths per year from PM10 in cities. If I were to put up a chart about indoor air pollution, you would see numbers that are even higher, and they're not covered on this chart. The chart that I just showed you and the levels of air pollution that I just showed you, just to give you a sense, corresponds generally with this map of the world. These are estimated PM concentrations in world cities, the annual averages of larger cities above 100,000, and indeed the high levels we saw on the WHO guideline chart and the high levels of mortality are very prominent in Asia and some parts of Africa especially. So we'll hear a lot today about the challenges in China, and I think that's all true, and there's a lot to be done. I think it's also fair to point out that China's made a lot of progress in some areas. Some of the areas where there have been progress made is in this trends in passenger car exhaust emission standards. And you can see the United States and the EU started much earlier, back in the 70s and the 80s, and had very stringent standards. And although China started much later in the late 1990s, they've actually come a long way in a very short period of time, and that's encouraging. They were also one of the first Asian countries to remove lead from gasoline totally. One of the nice things about that is they did it before it got into the population and caused a lot of widespread population exposures, and they actually did it before some parts of Spain. They have low fuel sulfur in some of the major cities, including Beijing, some stationary source controls that are getting a little bit better in different parts of the country. And those of you who saw the New York Times yesterday saw that they actually are moving forward pretty aggressively with some advanced stationary source, very advanced, efficient stationary source generating facilities. So there's some progress, but there's quite a bit more to be done. This won't be a surprise at all, but part of the reason why there's more to be done is as we look from the current day up to 2035, we see a continuing escalation in projected energy consumption and a similar escalation in projected vehicle growth. And of course, there'd be a dip in here for a recession, but I don't think anyone is necessarily saying that that's going to change dramatically. This is a shot of a city in western China. There are more significant problems in the west, as you can see, with some of the large stationary sources and large levels of air pollution. And while there's been progress in some of the eastern cities, there are significant problems that remain there. So what do we do about this? There's lots of things to be done, but one of the things that HEI is doing for our small bit here is to expand the current science base to drive Asian air quality decisions. The challenge is that in Asia and in China, including China, there are limited or unorganized studies of air pollution and health in Asian populations. And while there's a lot of evidence in the West, there's often a reluctance for Asians to rely on Western studies, and they can be easily dismissed. An example is the American Cancer Society Pope study, which which is the preeminent study of the long-term effects of particulates and other air pollutants in the world, used for cost-benefit calculations everywhere, including in Asia. It was done in Ohio and in the United States, and people were quick to point out that Asian populations are very different. So the goal here is to spur policymakers by demonstrating the relevance of existing global science by documenting representative impacts in local Asian cities. This provides a near-term incentive to reduce traditional air pollutants because it's very cost-effective, and some greenhouse gases, as you'll hear about from Denise later, including black carbon and ozone. The way we've done this is through our PAPA program, and it's a partnership with a group called the Clean Air Initiative for Asian Cities to understand and communicate the health effects of air pollution throughout Asia. Beginning with, and I'll give examples of these, scientific review and meta-analysis of the health effects of air pollution in Asian cities, a unique web-based compendium of over 420 Asian studies. It's actually never been put together before. Support, and this is sort of a key link here, for on-the-ground epidemiological studies in key representative Asian cities. And at the end, a comprehensive assessment of air pollution and health across all of Asia, which will be published later this year. Throughout all of this, we've taken a very unique capacity-building approach by enabling local scientists and creating an ability for them to gain the skills and have the impact needed to drive regulatory decisions. And again, our overall goal is to communicate quality science to policymakers to drive Asian policy decisions and improve air quality. So at the beginning of a project like this, what do? You don't just jump in and start doing work. You need to survey the literature and see where the gaps are. And that's where we started with a PAPA literature review published a few years ago, The Health Effects of Outdoor Air Pollution in the Developing Countries of Asia. This was a systematic review of, at the time, you'll see, was 140 peer-reviewed studies of air pollution and health in Asian cities over some 23 years. And at the time, there were 60 from China. We took a special focus on studies of daily changes in air pollution and health. When air pollution goes up or down on a particular day, do you see a corresponding increase or decrease in mortality? And we conducted the first ever meta or joint analysis of 28 Asian time series studies to evaluate in depth the effects in Asian populations and to understand how do they compare to what we saw in the West. This was translated into Chinese, widely distributed, and as I mentioned, it's going to be updated this year. The second thing we did is we created a mechanism actually for surveying the Asian literature. No one's really brought together the studies in China alone, much less the studies from across Asia in one place where they're organized, they're accessible, and they're available on the web to everyone. So this is a unique resource for policymakers that we put together so we could understand, again, what's already been done, what the gaps were, and what the needed studies were looking forward. This is a current resource HAI makes available, PAPA-san, Science Access on the Net, and it's a compendium of over 400 studies of air pollution, exposure, and health effects across all Asian countries. Currently, there are over 110 in China, and we list the studies, the investigators, the pollutants, the locations, the results, lots of other useful information in a searchable database. A very useful tool, very useful, often used by WHO as they evaluate their guidelines. So what's it telling us? Well, one of the things, aside from what the individual studies are telling us, which is a longer task, is that Asia is starting to become much more productive in terms of generating studies of air pollution and health and air pollution and exposure, really beginning about 2000 when we started to see a pretty significant spike. So that's, I think, a very good sign. It's also telling us that there are some gaps, and these are the studies in China. They're a little bit difficult to see, but the main message here is that, as you'd expect, there are not a lot. Given the number of people in China, 110 studies is actually pretty small, and they tend to be concentrated. Shanghai with 14, Beijing, I think, had 19. Taiwan, of course, had 57. So they're concentrated also on the east. And when one goes to look to the west, back where you saw that photograph of very highly polluted areas, there isn't a lot of evidence. There aren't a lot of reasons to motivate local policymakers and local regulators to take action. Not that one needs to reinvent the wheel everywhere, but there's no substitute for evidence that says to a local regulator or a local EPB, Environmental Protection Bureau, that yes, the effects that are seen in other parts of the world are relevant to the people in my town. For our own research, we initiated time series studies, as I said, of daily levels of air pollution and mortality, PM10, SO2, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone in several major Asian cities, obviously 3 in China, but also 3 in India and 1 in Thailand. And it was to understand the effects in Asian cities individually, but to put together a regional analysis and to begin to get a broader perspective of what's happening across Asia. Building capacity was a unique way that we approached these. I think that stood us in good stead, and I think in terms of Sino-U.S. cooperation, and it's a place where EPA has also done some very good work in terms of their collaboration with the Chinese government in particular. It's enabled, I think, very good sets of relationships to develop, and I think at the end of the day will lead to more of a willingness to take action. When we funded these teams, we insisted on Asia-led and Asia-staffed investigator teams. And we paired them with highly qualified international scientists to design the studies in Asia. We provided active technical assistance throughout implementation. We had people who had never done these kinds of studies. We had data in China that was very flawed, air pollution and health data. And they had skills that they needed to acquire. We were able to provide those once they met sort of minimum standards and get some good studies done. And they were good studies. These were not sort of second-class studies. These were studies that needed to pass HEI standards of peer review. And so all of the Chinese teams, all of the Asian teams had site visits where they had data quality audits, often questions about the Chinese air quality and health data. We sent teams there to look at the data, see how it was collected, and evaluate its quality. In our particular cities, it was very good. As I also mentioned, the studies were designed for Asia-wide coordination and exchange. So beyond China and beyond individual cities, we were able to build a network of health scientists across Asia by having these teams who'd never worked with people in their own country work together across India, across China. And as you know, that's a pretty big void between India and China sometimes. But we had teams that worked very well together. And at the end of the day, they learned how to build credible studies and to do them well, working in collaboration. We also make sure that our science doesn't sit on the shelf. As I said, all of the teams needed to have pre-existing relationships with their EPBs, with their health boards, both so they could get data, but also at the end of the day so that the work they did would be seen as credible by the agencies that they brought it back to. Because if you had Westerners parachuting in to do work in China, you're not going to get much traction. And so at the end of the day, we also had Asian scientists briefing Asian policymakers, and that's actually worked pretty well. These are just the locations of the studies, and one that I won't talk about today looks at the added impact of poverty on air pollution and health in Vietnam. Those of you who follow literature, this is just a sample of some of our team members at one of our meetings will know. Some of the people we brought to the table is Kirk Smith, perhaps the leading expert on indoor air pollution effects around the world. Arden Pope, the PI for the Pope American Cancer Society study, and other people of that stature. So these people came away with some very good skills. So what did we find? Well, in 2005, when we did an initial review of the Asian literature, which was only 4 cities at the time, these had to meet certain quality tests. There weren't a lot of, studies, time series studies in Asia. These are studies of daily mortality and particulates. But there were enough to do an initial comparison. And so when we looked across 4 cities in Asia, 21 of the largest cities in Europe, and 90 of the largest U.S. cities in the Johns Hopkins NMAP study, we find daily mortality in response to particulates quite similar, perhaps strikingly similar. And we just recently updated this, and this will be in the new review that we have coming out later this year. 4 years have gone by. There's been more work done. There are now 420 studies in the database rather than 100. And this is a nice chart put together by Arden Pope, which looks at results of daily time series studies, again, studies of short-term effects across Europe, the United States, and a growing Asian literature. And we're still finding a very consistent effect, around 1.5 to 2 micrograms per 10 or 20 micrograms of exposure for PM. And the remarkable thing is the consistency rather than where a particular study falls, and that Asia is pretty much in line with other parts of the world. What this does is 2 things. It gives Asians some evidence in some of the key Asian cities, and there needs to be a few more of those types of studies. But it begins to increase the confidence that the really vast, broad Western literature that exists. We've been doing studies of air pollution and health since the London fog in the 50s. There are really many landmark studies that are very well done. And it begins to give Asians some confidence that despite many of the differences in diet and exposure and pollutant mixes, that people are probably more similar than dissimilar, and so that body of evidence can be seen as relevant and be seen as a basis for action. I won't go through this too much. We tend to have good impact with our studies, as I said, used by WHO in their air quality guidelines, working closely with EPA to brief China as part of some high-level RAQM, regional air quality management briefings with MEP and Chinese government officials about what we're finding, and a range of other countries as they deal with auto standards, as they deal with PM standards, and other questions. We tend to get press sometimes. One of the things that happens is when you're doing air pollution studies in a place where no one does air pollution studies, it tends to get noticed. And in Delhi, our study got very good coverage, and for good reason. And it's a shame that there aren't more studies out there so that people are understanding what the effects of air pollution are on their populations. My favorite slide, I think, and the one that I'll close this part of the presentation with, is sort of capacity building at its best. This is one of the first scientists from the University of Hong Kong to start one of the first PAPA studies, and he was basically getting capacity building from some of the experts that I showed you earlier. And this is a photograph of him basically being the technical expert advising the Vietnam team several years later implementing their study. So it's Asia to Asia technical assistance. And also, just last month, our team from Shanghai, who did their study and were in the position of beginning investigators when they started 4 years ago, just got funding from MEP to extend the PAPA protocol to do a whole series of studies across China with funding from the Chinese government. So that's, I think, a real test of confidence. So in summary, air pollution and health has significant local health impacts. China's made some progress, as I pointed out, in lead, vehicle standards, low sulfur fuels, some point source controls. Escalating energy demand and vehicle increases underscore the need for continued action. Reliance on Western studies and calls for greenhouse gas reductions alone can be problematic and can't provide the motivation, can be difficult in providing the motivation to spur action, especially in the near term. So one of the ways of approaching this is to take a health-based approach, doing representative studies using capacity-building models to marshal the existing science. People were surprised when they saw that there were 420 studies of air pollution and health in Asia. No one knew that that existing evidence base even existed. And bringing that together can really help the Chinese and the U.S. work more closely in unearthing this evidence and creating new evidence, documenting the effects in the local populations, and increasing Asian confidence in the representativeness or the relevance of the Western science on conditions in Asia, understanding that there are differences. At the end of the day, we hope that this will create additional motivation to reduce, to take steps to promote co-benefits, reducing local air pollutants that are also relevant for greenhouse gas reduction.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. So, are you gonna sit or do you want to stand? Okay, we got a group of standards today. I said no modern dance interpretation of their studies, but that they will just. Also, want to point out that I'm going to put it just in the Q&A. I mean, Bob mentioned about how EPA has been working with HEI and the PAPA studies. We smuggled in someone from the EPA Air Office from North Carolina, Dale Everett. So at some point, Q&A, Dale may have to say something, because or if you have questions about the EPA's work, which has been pretty phenomenal, looking at environmental health stuff. Oh, where's Gary? Oh, Gary. Oh no. Yeah. No, we don't. If we give Gary the microphone, he'll never give it back. So that's why we want. But okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, and you can use and that get some water. Okay. And the pointer does change the slides. And last thing, make sure you hold the mic close.
Good morning.
Yeah, there we go.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here, presenting this. I think it's a case study to follow that the overview Bob just presented. So this is a study we designed to first look at whether there is air pollution changes during the Beijing Olympics, and then we see whether that changes are related to health changes. So this, even probably before the Chinese government got the Olympics bid, I think it's around 2000, they started a series of air pollution controls to make sure that during the Olympics that air quality is not too bad. Let's put it that way. So it's a very, they realized this is a regional air pollution problem. It's not just the Beijing. And so the effort has been really quite regional. You can see here that the surrounding provinces have all gradually implemented a series of measures, mostly focused on energy structure. You can see that the coal, the heavy polluting fuels being gradually changed, and also the fugitive dust. They started grow trees in North Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, and Shanxi, those places. And also more in the Beijing and surrounding areas, they started to move out to the heavy polluting industry, like the famous Capital Steel factory, and also the refinery, oil refinery factory there. And of course, during the Olympics, then there's very aggressive series of actions are taking. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in my next slide.
Jim, can you make sure you hold the mic close, because we're on the webcast and they won't hear you. Sorry.
Thank you. So during Olympics, the fugitive dust stopped high polluting construction process. I think up to June or May, basically no constructions are allowed in Beijing. If you have a ongoing project, basically suspended until after the games. And the still heavy polluting, melting, all those factories were stopped operating starting in June or July. Cement plants were stopped. Chemical plants reduced its production capability, and also added pollution control devices into stacks. Power plant in the region also reduced pollution emission by 30%. Those are the actual numbers afterwards. People actually know how much emissions are. So, and then of course, as you know, the whole world watching the games, the most dramatic control action is the traffic control, you know, ban yellow labeled vehicles in Beijing, which are high polluting ones, and stopped 70% of government-owned vehicles in July. Basically, only the government-owned, the officials cannot really take the government cars, and lots of the public transportation tools. They opened the new subway lines, that sort of thing, just in time before the games started. And starting on July 21st, 2008, they implemented this even odd number system. So the only, the cars can be only on the road on the other day, and the also emission controls in the passenger cars and also the other vehicles like trucks got tightened, and during the games, basically no trucks are allowed to travel within the sixth ring road of Beijing. So now I go into this particular study. So what all those control actions actually mean in terms of air pollution levels in Beijing. So we have designed a study. It's called Health Effects of Air Pollution Reduction Trial. This is a focused study. We have this is a study basically based in the Peking University First Hospital. This is a hospital affiliate to Peking University. That's where my local collaborators are from. And this is really located in the center of Beijing. I think it's about 1 kilometer west of Tiananmen Square. And, no very tall buildings because it's very close to the Tiananmen Square, and also the headquarters of the, Zhonglanhai, the Chinese top leaders, and surrounded by busy roads, traffic roads. So we, just like many other studies, we put the air monitors on the top of this building, which is located in the center of this hospital grounds. And this is what, 7th floor, whatever, basically for convenience, because, less disturbance, whatever. Whether that's best captures the exposure, it's less ideal than if you put on the, at the breathing zone level of people. But, this is practically most convenient and doable. So this is, then, we started monitoring air pollution at this site in June 2nd, and continued monitoring until end of October. And so I have a student taking pictures on this building because every day he has to go to replace the filters. And so, from that building and taking photos from, this is a photo on June 6, 2008. And before the Olympics, you're going to see many days like this for those who travel to Beijing. This is probably not, it's pretty familiar to you. So lots of days with a gray sky because of the high particulate matter levels. This is during the Olympics. It's not every day is like this, of course. Later on, I'm going to show you the actual pollution levels. Well, let's just keep automatic going. Huh? But, more days are like this during the Olympic Games. This is an actual measurement of PM 2.5, fine particles. And it started June 2nd, going to the end of October. You can see there is lots of day-to-day variation, which is expected because air pollution is not only determined by emissions, but also largely affected by weather conditions. So there is big meteorology variation from day to day, and that reflects this. So this is a daily average. So you can see, however, this is June 21st. That's the start of the traffic control, and you see this is media levels or whatever for PM 2.5 is 100, and come down to the during Olympics. This is Olympics. This is actually special, what they call Paralympics. Olympics. Yeah. So levels are on average about half of the levels in the earlier days, and there is even larger variability in September and October because that's in Beijing. That's the fall weather. You have a more windy days, some days. Much larger meteorology variability. And this is NO2. Okay, yeah. Oh, this is SO2. Okay. Sulfur dioxide, you can see that similar trend, and there is a couple of days just before, actually after the 21st, there's a local source there. We don't know. We try to see who is burning something. Maybe by that's a local source because the other monitoring station. The results doesn't show this, so it must be a very local source there for SO2. And maybe somebody doing illegal combustion of something, who knows?
Right underneath your monitor.
But as you see SO2 here, it's much lower. I mean, maybe fireworks. Yes, that's right. Well,
did you say fireworks?
The illegal ones. The illegal ones that they capture. And here is NO2, which is much better traffic signal compared to the PM others, because PM has a regional sources, that kind of thing. NO2 is more, it's a better indicator of mobile sources. And you can see that, the NO2 levels started to drop right at the beginning of the traffic control, coming down. This is after the Olympics, the Paralympics. The traffic control is not as rigid as during the Olympics. I think it's every 5 a day, whatever. It's not every other day, the odd event, whatever. So anyways, the control is relaxed a little bit. You can see NO2 goes up right away, and then of course after Olympics, it's going back rise very quickly. And this is carbon monoxide, also a traffic closely related to traffic emissions, similar trend. And this is elemental carbon, which is people normally use as a good indicator of vehicle emissions, especially diesel vehicle. And we can see that this during the Olympics, when truck traffic is controlled, the levels are much low. And then right after that, maybe this is the National Day, October 1, maybe lots of trucks come in to bring goods or whatever, or after a long a period of banning coming in, maybe there's huge increases in numbers. Who knows? But anyway, you can see the levels increased pretty substantially after the control. And the ozone, there is no decrease during the control period because this is more a secondary pollution, secondary pollutant. And when NO traffic emission is controlled, actually NO, nitric oxide levels are reduced, and that's a sink for ozone. So actually, you reduce the sink, so ozone levels got increased. This is seasonal. In the fall, the photochemical activity is much reduced, and also the NO emissions got increased. So ozone after the control period is much lower as expected. So this is a summary of the changes, just on the mean, if we do the during, post-Olympics, and for most of these pollutants, the CPM 2.5 average reduced by 34%, SO2 60%, but that's affected by those couple of spikes, so it's not very reliable. And carbon monoxide, ozone, basically no change, and elemental carbon 40% change. This is compared to the pre-control period. Some, for example, elemental carbon actually increased, and NO2 also increased. Seasonal impact, that also the emissions. So that's the pollution monitoring, and we wanted to also look at what that means for people's health. So this is a pretty busy cartoon, but as Bob showed, that PM or other air pollutants, meaning particulate matter, is related to respiratory mortality and morbidity, and also cardiovascular death and illness. So basically, epidemiology look at this level and the link to at the end, right? Either the death counts or the other measures of disease. But what's really happening in the body, which is called the biological mechanisms, we know actually very little about it. So this is a hypothesis. People think, oh, you got PM, it got into your lung, then maybe you can have a lung inflammation, and that causes systemic inflammation because the lung is a part of your body, so it must be related to your entire body system. And then maybe you're going to change your vascular function, and all those things are basically biological pathways that possibly link the air pollution exposure to the ultimate measure of disease or death. This is because people measured the cardiac electrical systems. Maybe pollution also changed the time. You remind me? Okay. So what the study we designed is that, well, we're going to try to measure some markers indicative of this is steps, right? We call biomarkers of inflammation, of oxidative stress, of coagulation, your blood getting easier to clot, maybe that cause you a heart attack and then cause a cardiovascular event. So the biologists and the toxicologists have developed markers, mostly in animal rodent models in the lab, and we try to, analyze some of those markers in actual, people in Beijing. And if we see changes at the cell level or molecular level, then we'll try to sort of, confirm whether those hypothesized mechanisms are actually is the ones that actually link the pollution exposure and health endpoints. So I'm not going to go through the details, but we measure lots of biomarkers, which basically reflect each of those pathways that are shown in that cartoon. So the actual study is we are going to focus on those top panel, my colleagues are doing the other two groups. We have basically recruited 128 healthy medical students. Those are the young, men and women in their 20s, and they work in that first hospital because it's easy. They stay there. They work there. They live there. They, if we just set up that monitor, so that one monitoring site probably can reflect their exposure because they're, they just have a very rigid lifestyle in that campus. So that's one of the reasons we select those students as our study subjects. And we, as I said, the other studies are also look at whether the air pollution affect elderly and children the same or different compared to the effects in young adults. I'm only going to talk about results from the first panel. That's the one have the most comprehensive measurements of biomarkers. So the design is we did each person measured twice, one before the July 21 when they started the traffic control, and 2 times during this period, before the after the traffic control up to the end of the Paralympics. Sorry, and then measured them twice again after the games. So those are we were still analyzing samples. So lots of samples. Each person measured 6 times, 128, and you can do a simple math. Lots of samples. Some lab analysis is very time consuming. So we to date will only measure some markers that are a little bit less time consuming, or whatever we can manage to be able to finish by now. So this is a exhaled nitric oxide. This is a marker of pulmonary inflammation. Actually, this was used by clinically for people who have asthma, COPD, whatever. If you measure this ENO during the disease exacerbation period, it's markedly higher than during the stable period. So it's a well-established marker of lung inflammation. And you can see those are the group mean, that's the dot. Those are the 50 percentile, 75, 25 percentile, those box plots. You can clearly see that during the control period, those are the 2 measurements, 2 visits, 2 measurement time is lower, right? So it means their lung inflammation status got much better improved. And afterwards, they go up again, okay? So that's very nice marker to show really related to the pollution changes. This is a marker, nitrite ion in the exhaled breath condensate. Basically, you exhale and then condense the breath into a liquid, and we measure those. This is a marker of pulmonary inflammation and also oxidative stress. I'm going to talk about oxidative stress a little bit later. And we also see during the games, the 2 visits have lower levels. We can do the statistics, and they are significant because the reason why we pick up 128 is because of statistical power considerations. And another marker, this is the aldehyde called a mannan dialdehyde, is a marker of pulmonary oxidative stress. This is basically our body doesn't like the oxidative damage or stress. And that's why, when I drink the tea this morning, they say, that tea bag has antioxidant. Basically, our body like to have our oxidative levels low. That's related to natural aging, for example. If you always have a very high oxidative stress levels in your body, probably, you're going to be aging faster. Many factors affect oxidative levels. nutrition, psychological stress, whatever work stress, yeah, of course. And but this is air pollution. We can see that those V2 maybe there's a couple of days that has a lower pollution, whatever. We will do the analysis relate 1 day's measurements to the same days or the day before air pollution level. We're going to do that analysis, but just to do this, visit a specific comparison, you can still see that those are lower here, and then did not go back, because we saw some pollutants are actually low post on the games, like ozone, whatever. This is very complex. So maybe one pollutant is going up, one pollutant is going down. So which one is really doing this? So we're gonna need to sort that out. But the picture is that we do see a decrease in oxidative stress levels, and if you relate those kind of molecular biology measurements to the recently published paper by, I think, Pope and Dockery in New England Journal of Medicine, they said the air pollution control regulation, whatever, or the air pollution improvement in the United States in the last 2 decades caused a increased life expectancy for 6 months or whatever. So if you relate to that, that makes sense, because if you have a high air pollution, you have a high levels of body level burden of oxidative stress, and oxidative stress will relate to the natural aging. Things maybe you have a story there. But anyway, those are the only few of the biomarkers I have results. We're going to have much more. And so what those really mean? I think clearly that clean air during the Beijing Olympics is directly translated to reduce the body burden of oxidative stress and inflammation, even in those very healthy, non-smoking young adults. So the other data, pending data on other respiratory and cardiovascular endpoints will provide a more complete picture of the effects of reducing air pollution on public health during and after the Olympic period. So this is a really interesting opportunity to evaluate reversibility of air pollution, because those changes. We will see what of those biological pathways are reversible, what are less reversible, because things are maybe if you have a high pollution today, tomorrow pollution get reduced, maybe changed back, and some maybe it's permanent damage. We hope our study will give us some insights regarding to those questions. So this is a study you can see need really a multidisciplinary effort, and we indeed fortunate to lead a very collaborative team. Which have Dr. Kippen, who is a physician, who keeps educating me about what those endpoint means. Dr. Rich is an epidemiologist. Dr. Dio, I did not mention we have a genetic piece here as well. We are looking at individual genetic variation, how that's going to affect people's susceptibility to responses to air pollution changes. That's Dr. Dio is a geneticist. I have Dr. Liu at Ole Strickland, or the biostatistician. I think they have a much tougher job now with all this data coming. And my student, my lab technician, in Peking University, we have air pollution special experts like Dr. Tong Zhu. Physicians in First Hospital, they really recruited these people, Dr. Wang, Dr. Zhu, and made those clinical measurements at other people who are either have expertise in epidemiology and toxicology. I also have Dr. Duncan Thomas, who is helping with data analysis as well. And this is part of the team. It's hard to get everybody together, but those are the ones we had 2 meetings in Beijing, and this is the early one we get together to design the protocols. And so we have the study was funded by Health Effects Institute. Thanks, Bob. And also from NIH, NIEHS, and China side, the China National Science Foundation funded those two other cohorts I did not mention, the elderly group and the children's group. And Beijing Environmental Protection Bureau, they basically supported the air pollution equipment for those monitoring. And without the study's participants, none of those kind of health studies will be possible. And there are probably 50 graduate students working during last summer, lots of volunteers, really with a high spirit. The
Olympic spirit.
Yes, indeed, they had that. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move to where they're talking about the on-the-ground studies, and Denise is going to take us global, right?
I'm going to take you global.
Take me global. And do hold the mic close.
Okay, I'm Denise Mauserall from Princeton University. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank Jennifer Turner from the Wilson Center and Bob O'Keefe from the Health Effects Institute for putting all of this together. I'm going to try now to take you to the interconnections between air pollution and climate change and the impacts of air pollution on health as well. So a key thing to realize is that air pollution and climate change are interconnected. Air pollution levels are highly sensitive to weather, and it follows that climate change will likely have air quality implications. That's because on hot days, photochemistry goes faster, and stagnation events appear to be more likely as climate warms. And so climate change is likely to make air pollution in many parts of the world worse. Conversely, some air pollutants increase radiative forcing. So you're probably wondering, what is radiative forcing? Radiative forcing is essentially the amount of energy that's trapped in the atmosphere by greenhouse gases or by aerosols, and that acts to warm the climate. You can think of it a bit like if you're cold and you put on a blanket, the energy that your body releases is the radiative forcing that results in the temperature going up. Some air pollutants increase radiative forcing. Examples of those are ozone and black carbon. Black carbon is soot, and I'll show you some pictures of what black carbon looks like. Other air pollutants decrease radiative forcing, and those include sulfate aerosols and organic carbon aerosols, and this results in cooling. And so what that means is that some air pollution regulations, which have been reducing SO2, sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants, are actually removing the umbrella we've essentially had up that has been reflecting solar radiation back to space and shielding us from the full warming effect of long-lived greenhouse gases. And I'll show you a result from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that indicates that more quantitatively. So reductions in the emission of air pollutants can either warm or cool the climate. Thus, clearly, integration of air quality and climate stabilization goals in environmental policy design would be highly beneficial. I'm going to stay global for a little while, and then I'm going to go through fairly quickly a number of studies that we've done and just show you the results. And so if people are interested in the methodology that goes into those studies, feel free to talk to me afterwards. And at the very end, I'll show you a web page, my web page, where you can actually access all of the papers if you're interested in the details. You've heard in some detail how air pollution adversely impacts health. I won't go through this in any detail. I just want to reiterate that both long-term and short-term studies have indicated that aerosols, PM2.5, are damaging to health, that ozone is also associated with premature mortalities and respiratory ailments, and finally that elevated ozone concentrations have been shown very clearly to reduce agricultural yields. And some of our work that I'll show at the very end, if I have time, quantifies some of the current and projected impacts of surface ozone concentrations on agricultural yields in East Asia. This is a figure that's a little complicated. I'll try and walk you through it from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is showing the global radiative forcing due to emission changes from the pre-industrial time to the present. And I'm highlighting here the important contributions of air pollutants. So if you look here, these are long-lived greenhouse gases. The first one is carbon dioxide. This is methane. And these are a few others: halocarbons, nitrous oxide, and some of the fluorocarbons. You can see that CO2 has the largest radiative forcing, and that there's justifiable emphasis on reducing CO2. However, these are short-lived gases, and these are the aerosols. What you can see here that I've highlighted is the effect of tropospheric ozone and black carbon on positive radiative forcing. Methane is a precursor for ozone. This is the tropospheric ozone that's produced from the oxidation of methane. And then here you can see the ozone that's produced from the reaction of carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and hydrocarbons. In addition, you can see the positive radiative forcing here from black carbon. This is just from the aerosol itself. You can see the negative radiative forcing, the cooling effect from sulfate aerosols, from organic carbon aerosols, from mineral dust, and then this is the indirect effect. It's estimated. It's a highly uncertain value, but the sign is clear that clouds become whiter when you have more cloud condensation nuclei. The droplets are smaller, and they become whiter, and they reflect more solar radiation back to space. So if you have sulfate aerosols or other types of aerosols which attract water vapor, you get whiter clouds. So here you can see the cooling effect of aerosols. Thus, efforts which are very justifiable for environmental reasons to reduce acid rain and to reduce sulfate loadings in order to protect health are basically removing the umbrella we've had that has been cooling our climate. So as we shut that umbrella, unless we take action to reduce other short-lived compounds, we should expect an increased rate of climate warming. So what is this idea of co-benefits? The idea is that strategic reductions in the emissions of some greenhouse gases, like methane, can improve air quality. The reason for that is, if you look here again, methane is a precursor for ozone. If you reduce methane concentrations, you get the climate benefit of reducing methane. You get the climate benefit of reducing ozone. You get the health benefits and the agricultural benefits of reducing ozone also. In addition, strategic reductions in the emissions of some air pollutants, like black carbon, can benefit climate. It can also benefit health. Reductions of others, like sulfate and SO2, will increase warming. So a goal is to identify emission reduction strategies that will simultaneously improve air quality and reduce climate warming. These are projected emissions for SO2 and black carbon that have been developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a number of different scenarios ranging from more pessimistic to more optimistic. You can see a general trend that SO2 is projected to go up and then to come down. This is projected emissions of black carbon. This was done in draft form. It's highly debated, but you can see that generally the expectation is that black carbon will rise. It may rise and then come down. It's always hard to predict the future, but the general trend appears to be upwards. So what is black carbon? Black carbon is a complicated entity. Contained black carbon emission sources, basically diesel engines and very contained stoves, emit very black soot. You can see here. Contained black carbon emission sources are dominated by fossil fuel combustion, especially diesel engines. Organic carbon, which cools, is co-emitted in only small quantities. So contained combustion of fossil fuels results in a strong warming effect. There's been discussion, well, if we reduce forest fires, we'll reduce black carbon emissions. And if you look at maps of where black carbon comes from, you can see that a lot does come from fires. However, fires co-emit organic carbon. Organic carbon tends to be much lighter. As you remember from the IPCC figure here, organic carbon is here, it cools. And as you can see from this picture of the fire, it's fairly white and reflective. And so, according to some work that we've done, as well as work that others have done, I won't have time to go through in any detail, or at all, actually.
I'm a mean chair.
Forest fires tend to have a cooling effect, negligible or negative warming effect from aerosols. So an emphasis from a policy perspective on reducing black carbon emissions from diesel engines would be highly useful from an air quality, health, and climate perspective. So where does black carbon come from? This is actually a figure that comes from a study. I led a workshop at the Woodrow Wilson School done by graduate students. If you really want a copy, I have hard copies, a few hard copies here, not many. I have the whole report on my website. You'll have the link at the end. But what we've done here is we've characterized the combustion that releases black carbon into contained combustion, shown in red, which is most likely to result in a high black carbon to organic carbon ratio, and then emissions from the other sources, waste, agricultural residues, savannas, and forest emissions. Here's China. China is responsible for 19% of black carbon emissions and the most contained combustion emissions of any region. This includes black carbon from stoves as well as black carbon from diesel engines. Here you can see other Asia, India, Africa. Much of the burning in Africa is from open savanna fires, and so you can see here the purple bar is the largest. So Africa is in total largest, but in fact, from a climate perspective, China is far more important. Here you're looking at the breakdown of global black carbon emissions by source, weighted by the radiative forcing contribution. And so, as I said, black carbon is often co-emitted with organic carbon. What we've tried to do here is weight it so you can see the relative radiative forcing of the different sources. So diesel on-road emissions contribute the most in terms of radiative forcing. Coal from industry, second. Diesel off-road, third. Coal residential use, fourth. Wood residential use, fifth. And then the numbers get smaller thereafter, and savanna and forest are cooling.
Global.
That's global. So it seems clear that we should reduce black carbon. Why is it difficult to do? There's still a fair bit of scientific uncertainty and complexity and chemical variability in black carbon. If you want to regulate it, what exactly is it? There's a large proportion of emissions from developing countries, and that makes it more challenging to have an influence from the U.S. The emission sources are quite dispersed. Diesel engines are fairly straightforward as a sector to address. Biomass or coal stoves are more difficult. There's a high cost of replacement technologies. If you're going to retrofit all diesel engines, it's expensive. That's why I think for Asia it's incredibly important now, as we begin to see from the earlier figure that Bob showed, how transport is going to just take off a factor of 4 increase in the next 20 years, that we get in on the ground now and attempt to have standards in vehicles and fuel that are able to reduce the black carbon emissions in new vehicles, at least. It's not clear that that will happen, but it's very important to try and make it happen. And then finally, there's administrative challenges of black carbon emissions reductions because of the nature of the dispersed sources. However, there's great opportunities presented by black carbon mitigation. It has a short lifetime and a high radiative forcing, which means that reductions yield rapid climate benefits. If we want to buy time in order to reduce the emissions of the long-lived greenhouse gases and slow the rate of climate change, which is also important in terms of the impacts that climate change will have, black carbon is a great knob to turn. There's immediate availability of solutions. We know how to reduce black carbon emissions from diesel engines. There's clear health benefits. We've just heard about the clear impacts that particulates, and black carbon is a component of particulates, have on health. There's energy efficiency and service quality gains that can be achieved. There's infrastructure development, like vehicle sector development. There's political advantages and funding sources chasing co-benefits. Might not be quite as sort of touchy as some of the greenhouse gases. And also, there's an opportunity here for Arctic protection. As it turns out, black carbon emissions that are emitted in the mid-latitudes to high latitudes deposit in the Arctic, and they increase the rate of melting of snow and ice. This is actually particularly important in China, where emissions from India and China can deposit in the Himalayas and accelerate the melting of the glaciers there, which are an extremely important source of water for China and for India. This is simply showing you in a graph how black carbon and carbon dioxide are different in terms of relative radiative forcing. Because the lifetimes are really different, the relative radiative forcing over time of 1 ton each of black carbon and CO2 emitted over the course of 1 year differ. So you can see here there's 1 ton that's been emitted over the course of the year for black carbon and for CO2. CO2 is a long lifetime, so you emit the same amount, incrementally it builds up. And then it sticks around for a really long time. So the radiative forcing of that CO2 is going to be around for a really, really long time. Whereas with black carbon, it's emitted, it ramps up very, very fast. Its lifetime is actually on the order of about a week. You stop emitting it, it's gone. Big advantage. So in summary for black carbon science, black carbon is not like greenhouse gases. In fact, the 2 degrees Celsius target, which is something that the European community has said they're aiming for, and which there's general agreement you need to have a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature or less in order to avoid what the Framework Convention says is dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It's very difficult to achieve without tackling black carbon because of that strong radiative forcing. It has strong regional effects. It's not uniformly distributed around the world like the long-lived gases are. And it has costly impacts on human health.
Mike, I love it. Thanks.
In terms of black carbon in the U.S., there's opportunities to target the transport sector, diesel retrofits, improve fuel efficiency, especially locating super emitters may help reduce black carbon emissions, reduce off-road vehicle emissions, and switch fuel from, say, diesel to hybrids. In developing countries, including China, they're major growing contributors. Developing nations are more vulnerable to climate change and health effects, and a focus on transport fleets, new vehicles, and retrofits, as well as stoves, would be very useful. There's potential for international policy. I think an intergovernmental panel on climate change special report on black carbon would be useful. There's potential for hotspot treaties in the Arctic or in Asia where it affects the Himalayas and the water sources of the glaciers there. Maybe global technical standards, maybe funds from multilateral banks. We debated a lot in the course. This is actually coming from the task force I led last semester. We debated a lot whether it would make sense to try and integrate black carbon into a climate agreement and allow trading of black carbon with greenhouse gases. And we decided that it really doesn't appear to be very feasible. They're so different in terms of their lifetime, in terms of their sources. It's very difficult to imagine a simple trading scheme. And so integrating the air quality regulations into and having air quality regulation, people think more about the implications for climate, and integrating it in some fashion in that way, I think, would be more advisable. So I've told you sort of in that graph that air pollution has an effect on climate. There's some work that's been done as part of the U.S. climate change science program, which has used atmospheric models to really examine what the impacts are of climate change, of air pollutants on climate. And it appears that there's strong sensitivity of 21st century climate to projected changes in short-lived air pollutants. The reductions in SO2 emissions and hence sulfate aerosols, plus continued increases in black carbon and ozone, will likely result in substantial warming. A large and growing fraction of black carbon emissions comes from developing countries in Asia. Reductions in black carbon emissions would be advantageous for both air quality, public health, and climate change. And reductions in methane emissions, I'll talk more about this in a little bit, which is a greenhouse gas and a precursor of ozone, would also be advantageous for both air quality, public health, and climate change. So this is a figure taken from the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, came out just this past year, showing the summer 2100 surface temperature change due to short-lived gases and particles. This is summer 2100 relative to summer 2000. So what you can see here is that this is in, unfortunately, it's in degrees Kelvin, which is essentially degrees Celsius. And you can see that the changes are projected to have actually quite a significant effect on temperatures in the U.S. So 2 to 3 degrees Celsius over the central U.S. and significant impacts over Asia. I have to say this is from one model, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab's model in the United States. It needs to be replicated. This is pretty new research that's being done. But it's something I think that more attention needs to be placed on. And the past IPCC assessments have actually not included in their simulations the effects of changes in short-lived pollutants. The next assessment will. So all of the projections of climate warming that you've seen in the press and so far have not included this effect. So what I'd like to do now, since I've given you the sort of the broad overview, is then to just very quickly go through the results of some of the research papers my group has come up with in the last couple of years. This is a paper done by my graduate student in collaboration with people at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, looking at changes in aerosol emissions from China and its impact on global public health and radiative forcing. Like I said, I won't have time to tell you about the methodology, so you might just wonder about how in the world did we get these results.
We will believe you.
But you can look at this paper on my website. It just came out actually last week. So you shouldn't believe me, actually. Well, no, science is always a matter of debate. So this is new work. It needs to be replicated. There's lots of uncertainties, but I think it gives you a feeling of what the impacts might be. So our objective was to look at the year 2000 and then for 3 different scenarios in 2030, look at the impact of emissions of sulfur dioxide, which is a sulfate precursor, organic carbon and black carbon, both on premature mortalities globally and on radiative forcing. And this is a model study using models of air pollution, emissions and transport, and then of radiative forcing. So what you can see here are emission scenarios for the base case, and then for 2030, which is what we call business as usual, current legislation, which basically means all existing legislation which is on the books, which is probably not enforced at this point, or is scheduled to come into effect in the future. We assumed all of it actually was perfectly enforced. And that's this situation. And then this is even more optimistic. This is maximum feasible reduction. All existing technologies that we know of that can reduce emissions are implemented regardless of cost. So extremely optimistic, probably really inconceivable, but we wanted to look at what the very best case scenario might be. And so in the base case, you can see in parentheses here the amount that's coming of the global total that comes from China for SO2, for sulfate. Some sulfate's directly emitted, but you can see most of it comes out as SO2, organic carbon and black carbon. The emissions go up substantially in business as usual, and they go down only a small amount in this current legislative situation because total activities go up so much that even if you implement the current legislation, you don't go down much. And then this goes down fairly significantly. This is the global total emissions in the inventory. So what we find is that on the effect of China's emissions on annual premature mortality, in its base case, not surprisingly, the majority of deaths occur in China. And I have to say, this is about 500,000 deaths per year. This is a very conservative estimate because our model resolution is fairly coarse, so we don't get the high concentrations in the cities that you would actually see. But it's sort of a low-end estimate. And then you can see this is a global model, so we were able to look at the downwind impact of the emissions from China on other regions in the world. And so Southeast Asia and Korea and Japan are impacted to the tune of about 10,000 people each. You can also see some effects on North America and Europe that are much more modest, but not non-existent. You can see with business as usual, the numbers go up, for China itself by 50%. In the current legislative situation, they stay about the same at about 500,000, and in the maximum feasible reduction, they go down by about half. So there's a lot of people that are adversely affected. To get these values, we're using epidemiologically determined concentration response relationships like what Bob described. We also then looked at the radiative forcing from sulfate, organic carbon, and black carbon originating from China. And what you can see here is that sulfate cools, like I've said before, and black carbon warms. In the base case, the net effect of these aerosol emissions is cooling. In the business as usual case, the net effect is even stronger cooling. In the CLE case, it's still cooling somewhat. And in the maximum feasible reduction case, it's cooling a lot less. And that's because it's pretty easy to remove sulfur from power plants. So China's aerosol emissions currently create negative radiative forcing, offsetting global warming, but at large costs to health. However, the negative forcing will decrease in the future as SO2 emissions decrease and black carbon emissions rise. Reductions in black carbon emissions provide an opportunity to reduce positive radiative forcing with simultaneous health benefits. This, again, is just a very quick summary of a paper done with a graduate student who actually is now an energy specialist at the World Bank. In this, we were looking at the impacts of air pollution on human health in China at the local scale, and looking at, again, implications for future air pollution and energy policies. We wanted to understand how severe air pollution was in eastern China in 2000, what were the resulting health impacts, and what was the monetary value of those health impacts. And then also, how severe will air pollution and health impacts be in 2020 if energy demand increases but no additional pollution controls are implemented? That's business as usual. Best available control technology is used, or advanced coal gasification technology is used. And this is this basic idea of IGCC, integrated coal gasification technology, where you could conceivably sequester the carbon dioxide underground. And then what is the monetary value of these health damages? We looked at a city within called Zhaozhuang, right in the center of this green region, and we used regional atmospheric chemistry models nested inside of coarser resolution regional model with then a global model providing boundary conditions to this model. And I don't have time to really probably go through the whole integrated assessment structure that we use, but this is the type of approach we use for many of these efforts, where we look at energy consumption and technology scenarios to develop an emission inventory, to then calculate ambient air pollution concentrations, to then get human exposure, which is calculated based on ambient concentrations and population distributions, and then to get health impacts. And I tend to focus on the number of deaths because those are what are valued most highly in monetary terms, and then to calculate the economic costs. And here, to get the economic value of the premature mortalities, we used a willingness to pay study conducted in China. And to give you some perspective, in year 2000 US dollars, a human life, according to the US EPA, was valued at about $6.5 million. In China, it was valued at about 35,000 US dollars. And when I presented this in China, a government official said, $35,000, much too high. So given the $35,000 value of a human life, we calculated the percent of Zhaozhuang's GDP that air pollution was costing, and realized that the air pollution from Zhaozhuang disperses. I don't actually have the figures here, but the Zhaozhuang pollution doesn't just stay in Zhaozhuang, it goes elsewhere. And like you saw in the previous study where you have premature mortalities around the world, you get the premature mortalities we calculated actually within this region here, just within the green region. And that results in the year 2000 in about a 10% hit to Zhaozhuang's GDP. In 2020, business as usual, 16%. If you use best available control technology, because activity increases so much, you would still be at around 13%, and only with advanced coal gasification technology and aggressive efforts to reduce pollution will you drop below those levels of 2000. So these are the health impacts based on particles. I now just want to quickly tell you a bit about the...
2 minutes?
2 minutes? Oh, can I have 3 minutes?
Okay, 3. We'll arm wrestle if you go beyond 3.
So let me just tell you a little bit quickly about tropospheric ozone, because we've talked a lot about particles. Tropospheric ozone also has impacts on health, but it in addition has impacts on agriculture. So as I've said before, ozone is a greenhouse gas. It's a component of photochemical smog. We heard from Jim Zhang about its changing concentrations in Beijing. It's a precursor for OH. This is a little atmospheric chemistry lesson for you, but OH is really important because it removes the reactive air pollutants from the atmosphere. A precursor for ozone is methane. And so if you, like I've said, if you lower methane emissions, you can lower ozone. And background ozone concentrations are increasing globally due to, in part, to increasing methane. So what you see here is a figure background how background ozone is growing. This is from 1870, where it was at about 20 parts per billion, and it increases up to 50 parts per billion in 1990 at European sites. The projection, this is a modeling exercise where they calculated using the IPCC scenarios future ozone concentration increases in 2100 relative to 2000. You can see an additional 50 parts per billion increase projected for eastern China and parts of India. So you're going from a pre-industrial concentration of about 10, or early industrial period concentration of about 10, to 50 now, to potentially 100 in 2100. We hope this is supposed to be a worst case scenario. We hope it is a worst case scenario, but the projections look alarming. So I'm going to skip over this. This is a methane work. But I wanted to show you the impacts that we calculate of surface ozone distributions on grain production in China, Japan, and South Korea. The thing I'd like to emphasize here is that this is yield reductions based on 7-hour or 12-hour mean ozone concentrations. This is yield, 100% yield is here. This is ozone concentrations, 7-hour or 12-hour daily mean concentrations. You can see for soybeans are quite sensitive. The yields drop quite dramatically. So at 50 parts per billion, which is a fairly common concentration now, you're seeing a 20% reduction in soybean yields already. This is based on the U.S. NCLAN study. We took the concentration response relationships from this NCLAN study and applied them to Asia. And so here, what you're looking at are what model simulated concentrations are in 1990. And here you can see that concentrations were, about 40 parts per billion over much of China over the growing season for, this is winter wheat, single rice, spring corn, and soybeans. But the concentrations we project to grow substantially during the growing seasons in 2020, with concentrations over 70 parts per billion in many areas which are growing these primary main grain crops. So we then calculated relative yield losses in 1990 and 2020. The yield losses in 1990 were relatively modest, except for soybeans. So in most cases, ranging 5 to 10 to 15%. But soybeans were pushing 30% in this part of eastern China. In 2020, though, you see for winter wheat, corn, and soybeans, substantial yield losses projected at that point in time. Last slide. Okay. So in conclusion, air pollutants play a major role in climate change and should be viewed as a short-term lever in climate stabilization strategies. They really provide us with a tool to move things quickly now. There's opportunities for co-benefits. Black carbon emission reductions from contained combustion have clear co-benefits for both health and climate. Remember that truck with that black soot coming out. Methane emission reductions would decrease climate warming and surface ozone concentrations globally. Those are the slides I skipped. Providing co-benefits for climate, human health, and agricultural yields. There's opportunities in China to reduce methane from rice paddies and other areas, which are worth considering. Increases in efficiency in the use of renewable energy reduce emissions of both reactive air pollutants and carbon dioxide. Win-win option. Reducing methane and black carbon emissions should be viewed as a companion rather than an alternative to reducing CO2 emissions, as the latter is essential for long-term stabilization of climate. I think we can't lose our focus on CO2, but we should consider air pollution emission reductions within a framework of climate stabilization strategies. Thank you.
Great. And I'll take the mic. Thank you. Can I have the mic, please? Okay, we're going to open up for questions. Oh, right there. Hand right up. Why don't you give this mic to her, and then he takes it. So we'll go 1, 2. You weren't that fast, Lisa. You got to zip.
Hi.
You'll be second, just right afterwards.
Michael Brody with EPA, and thank you for a bunch of interesting presentations. I have a question for Bob. At the high levels of PM concentrations, are you going to be able to publish like a concentration response curve? Because it looks like it may be linear-ish. And then, Jennifer, are you going to have all these presentations up on the website?
Yeah, I was going to say that these hardworking people, we just handed them right before the presentation. So, but Lyndon will get them up online.
Thanks.
ASAP, right, Lyndon?
Denise's is already online.
Denise's is online. So yeah.
How charitable to call people who turn in their presentations late as hardworking people. It's very nice. Thank you
well,
so
you were
much.
hardworking.
That's a great question. And for those of you in the room, one of the big questions about particulates is are effects at the lower end, where there's not been a threshold identified below which effects are seen, but where the confidence intervals get quite wide. And that's been a real challenge from a regulatory perspective. And it looks like one cannot see a threshold, which is a continuing concern. And for Asia in particular, when you saw those very high levels of air pollution, and particulates especially, is that linear at the high end of the curve? Because if so, you'll be seeing very high levels of mortality across the population. We're looking at that. That's a really difficult question, obviously, and it's one of the things we'd like to understand. And we feel like if we begin to learn about the high end of the curve, it actually might be able to help us think about the low end of the curve and what's happening there. But part of the thinking is there may be a bit of a leveling off, or else we might be seeing even more mortality than people see already. But that's just speculation. It's an important question.
Lisa?
Thanks. I'm Lisa Friedman. I'm with Climate Wire. And I'm not sure who to direct this question to, so whoever wants to take it. But I was hoping that some of you could talk about what conversations are happening in China, making the links that you're making between air pollution and climate, and what conversations, if any, are happening at a policy level. Are there, is this part of the conversation that China is having internally as it heads toward Copenhagen? Thanks.
I'm guessing besides the panel that some of our EPA colleagues may have a few things to say.
I'd welcome feedback from the audience on this question. There's some small workshops I've attended in China on this that are intended by academics more than policymakers. My impression has been that the emphasis in China as far as air pollution mitigation goes from large point sources has been on SO2, and that actually there's been relatively little attention placed on black carbon. And I think it's an area that is worth integrating with the policy and government officials in China better. I think a lot more could be done. I think it's early still.
Actually, I'm going to put you on the spot, Jim. I mean, in your study that you're doing in Beijing, obviously the Beijing government, since they helped give you data, kind of noticed you were there. Are you maybe not yet? I mean, I know your preliminary studies and whatnot. I mean, they're interested in your work. What are they going to do with it?
Well, actually, let me put it this way. Yes, the Chinese government agencies
they knew you were
co-funded those things. Well, it's not directly, but the local researchers from Peking University, actually my collaborator, Dr. Tong Zhu, who led the study called CARE Beijing. This is a very large air pollution characterization study. Started 3 years before the Olympics. That's really got a direct, very strong government support. The goal is that they know that air quality is bad in Beijing, in the region as well. So again, with the primary focus on the air quality improvement for the Olympics, they funded that study. But afterwards, the last week I chatted with Dr. Zhu. He's clearly involved with the policymakers, discussion about what really need to be maintained after Olympics. I just showed the monitoring data up to October in that site, but they have more systematic monitoring of air pollution in Beijing. They have multiple sites, that kind of, which are more representative about the whole air quality. This is what I showed is just to support this one health study. So it's not, you see that SO2 spikes. Those are not representative for the whole situation in Beijing. But anyway, so what Dr. Zhu told me is that the air quality after the Olympics compared to the previous years are substantially improved, because the government still remains a very strong interest in maintaining some of the control measures. For example, those control devices they added on the stacks, they're not going to be taken away. Now, the question is, a couple of years later, when the lifetime is up, whether they're going to replace those things. But they are capable, just convincing people, say, gee, this is a nice thing. Some children, 15 years old or whatever, and the last August, that's the only time they saw blue sky. This is nice. And general public got the same impression. I know a couple of people who has nothing to do with air pollution or with science. They also say, yes, this is very nice, actually, jogging by, by the canal, that kind of thing. So the public has that kind of interest that I think will have a impact in the event, ultimate policy making process.
Dale, do you have anything to say? Oh, well, Bob.
Actually, I was just going to credit Dale, and we all don't have to answer each question, that's fine, but there's a few things. I think in Beijing, there were measures that were retained after the Olympics. They were, I think, 1 day a week car driving now is banned, and also there's a more stringent restriction on some of the government vehicles. And this was put up to a couple of popular referendums, and indeed there was widespread support in the Beijing populace for continuing some of the pollution reduction measures, and that's great. And of course, some of the pollution reduction measures, as Jim alluded to, will not go away. The transportation infrastructure, the extended subway, some of the clean fuels, the move to more stringent Euro standards will remain. And EPA, to their credit, has done very well in terms of engaging the Chinese, along with the Europeans, in these regional air quality management forums. And indeed, one of them was targeted at what were the lessons learned from the Beijing Olympics, and importantly, how can they be extended to other parts of China? And that's the key question, because Beijing, of course, was in many ways a symbolic accomplishment. And the challenge is to see whether or not some of those changes, which were very popular with the public and provided significant health benefits, as you saw from Jim's study, can now be really transferred to other parts of the country. And EPA has been working, as I said, with MEP and with industry at the table, and with the Chinese oil industry at the table, and also in Shanghai, working to increase public awareness of air pollution levels and air pollution measures. So you're building that public infrastructure and support. So at the end of the day, there's a willingness to take action. The black carbon piece of your question, I think, as Denise alluded to, is a little bit farther off, but that's an emerging concept.
Dale Everett from EPA's AIR program. Thank you, Bob, for those compliments. I'll just add a couple of things. One is that EPA had been working for some time on the connection between reducing air pollution and reducing greenhouse gases, say through energy efficiency measures. We've been working with them on labeling and taking existing buildings and making them more efficient. A lot of the stuff that we've done in this country with Energy Star and things like that. But in addition, and it's because of the work that Bob alluded to, that not only we, but lots of other people, including Bob and lots of other good organizations internationally as well as within China have been doing, there's an increasing focus on both PM 2.5 and ozone. These are things that were revealed more publicly during the Beijing Olympics, as people said, well, the air is, doesn't look that clean. What's going on here? And the measures that Beijing had put in place, or the Chinese had put in place, didn't capture a lot of those a lot of what was going on in the air. And so over the next 5-year plan, for instance, the 12th 5-year plan, they're proposing, we'll see how this plays out over the next few months as they develop that plan, a new standard for PM 2.5, the finer fraction of PM, and for ozone. Again, but getting back to what, or to reiterate what others said, they haven't addressed black carbon yet, though I did hear recently that there was a internal government conference on black carbon that the Chinese held. So obviously they're looking at it. The work that Denise and her colleagues have done is really pointing that some big advantages to doing that work there for both public health and climate.
Thanks, Dale. I know at the end of the table there's a question.
I just wanted to ask.
Oh, could you say your name?
Oh, I'm sorry. Renee Sho, I'm a reporter with McClatchy Newspapers. Dr. Zhang or Dr. Moserel, could you say something about China's reaction to the effects on agricultural yields? It seems to me that would be a key concern, and I'm wondering if Chinese scientists are working on this as well and coming up with similar findings about yields going down because of pollution.
Interestingly, the paper that I summarized for you actually made the Japanese government quite worried about the effect that ozone coming from China would have on Japanese agricultural yields. And they funded a major study that's taking place now in China that's involved tens, if not 100, Chinese scientists in collaboration with Japanese and American scientists, where they're doing field tests in Chinese fields looking at the effect of ozone on rice and wheat. And I don't imagine that you were able to see the figures well enough to realize that the U.S. studies found rice to be relatively robust to ozone and wheat to be very sensitive. The preliminary results from the field site in China now is showing that the current cultivars being used in China are more sensitive to ozone than the cultivars that have been used in the U.S. And so there's going to be integration with the Chinese government, I think, once the study is complete. But at this point, the work is new, and I don't think that there's a lot of ongoing other agricultural studies being done in China at this point.
But there are. But I mean, I think what's fascinating. I mean, well, depressing in the fascinating sense of depressing. I don't know that when you layer like what you were showing your map of the impacts on ag. I mean, I do more stuff on water and looking at water pollution and water shortages. If you laid those kind of predictions on top, I'm running screaming into the night.
Yeah,
because that's what you don't just look at the ozone impact on crops in isolation. You've got the water, and then they have recently China completed their 3-year survey of soil quality, which we don't have a lot of information on yet. So just even the actual contamination of I mean, there's a lot of factors going into it.
There's a lot of factors converging.
As well as the energy intensity of the diet.
And the energy intensity of the diet.
More soybeans and wheat and so on needed to produce the kind of food that China wants now.
Oh, too late. Okay, pass on to the orange gentleman, the orange Thailand.
Hi, Gene Martin with Asia Pacific Strategies. Let me just follow on that in terms of how much of all this research in China is stovepiped, where everybody works individually and there's very little cross-discipline coordination and discussion, whether it's water pollution or air or the question of various kind of pollutants. It's all related, not to mention public health. So I think, is there a growing network of people in the national EPA that's working together on these issues?
Go ahead.
You guys divide it up.
It's starting to come together, I think. And when I put up the Papasan database about the health effects and exposure studies across Asia, as I said, no one's had even put those together for any of the individual countries. And so that's beginning to have an evidence base that people can organize around. The PAPA studies themselves actually drove the creation of the first ever environmental chapter of the International Society of Environmental Epidemiologists in Asia. So that was a very good outgrowth of that. And from a purely policy organizational perspective, there's a group called the Clean Air Initiative for Asian Cities, which every 2 years now brings together policymakers, scientists, and NGOs and industry people from across Asia to talk about health effects, to talk about mitigation measures, and to talk about future impacts in other areas. And they're now averaging over 1,100 people at these meetings from all across Asia. So it's a wonderful forum, and there's some really good beginnings of a collective approach. And as Dale alluded to, there's work going on at a governmental level.
So I just to be a little bit more micro. Bob said, engaging more broad sectors, including policymakers, different scientists in different fields. I just talk about the scientists. Just to be frank, the collaboration across different disciplines has been always challenging anywhere, including sometimes it's hard for me to collaborate with my next door person, but in China it's extremely weak in that area. I think over the last 5 years, whatever, I tried. I have a what they call guest professorship or visiting professorship. I don't know what is the accurate translation from Chinese 客座教授. Anyway, so what I was trying to do is, this is an example, the heart study to. Actually, I have to work very hard. I would think that the local scientists would be, they can communicate more directly, but lots of the communications has to go through me with through New Jersey. That's right. But it's because it's a cultural issue. But gradually, that people would recognize that the environmental health problems are complex and really need people with different areas of expertise to work together. So that's I think that culture is changing, and it will take time, but we'll be there.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a program supported by Rockefeller Brother Funds, who supported me too. You got to tout the people that support you. Rockefeller Brother Funds actually helped funding the Social Science Research Council to set up what's called the China Environmental Health Initiative. That also, I think, and I keep wondering if I keep trying to hook them up with you guys up in Boston, Bob. Do you know them? I don't know if they actually created a research hub, gathering more broadly research on environmental health in China, and trying to and they actually moved their staff member to China to, again, trying to do little workshops and bringing diverse people together to talk about this issue. It's kind of like a specific China Environment Forum like we do, but really focused on bringing more of the health professionals in, which is also an exciting trend. I had another question, I think, right behind there. Oh, you have the mic. Good. Take the floor.
Hi, my name is Manisha Shah. I work with the National Renewable Energy Lab, but I've been involved with the EPA program, Integrated Environmental Strategies, which is a program that's been around for 10 years, and they have a whole body of co-benefits analysis in developing countries. And there's been 4 studies done in China. But one of the questions I had for the panel is, and I hope this is not too controversial, but in some of our work, most of our work has been done with, in conjunction with SEPA, but then also mostly with academics in China. And we, not necessarily through our work, but through working with some other colleagues, we've noticed that there's been some pushback from the Chinese government on releasing and accepting some of the health benefits impacts, or health impacts numbers, and especially with respect to impacts on mortality of air pollution. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that. There's the academic perspective and the researchers building a body of work, and I'm really glad to hear that you all are pushing that forward and working on that. But what has been your experience in terms of sort of the impact and the acceptance of this on policymaking? Thanks.
It's a very, sometimes actually it's a very disturbing situation. Let me give you an example of tobacco smoking. In 1998 or 7, I was invited. This is by then SEPA, which is now MEP. They were, that's the time that China just started. Everybody have their own apartments, whatever. So they do those indoor decoration, whatever. So there's lots of VOCs that come out of the materials that put indoors, and the media, the public, say, my child got leukemia because of benzene come off those, whatever. So anyway, they were very in a very short time period, they wanted to have a national indoor air quality standards, which they did actually. In a year or 2, they released those standards. But in preparation for that, I was invited to have this first workshop on indoor air, to give a review of the indoor air quality, indoor air problems, that sort of thing. And the sponsors are tobacco companies, which they never told me. And I got it, another person with me will give an overview. And they said, well, this is on behalf of the government. So later on, we find that the tobacco company is the biggest sponsors. And my colleague says, no, I cannot go. I said, no, I'm not coming. I said, your travel is not involved with us, that kind of thing. So they sort of at the last minute begged me to go. So I went there. And so, you just to tell them, I say, the largest indoor air problem still is the the ETS, environmental tobacco smoke. Oh, don't talk about that. We wanted to focus on those things. I said, I come here to give an overview. Initially I don't want to cover that part. Now I have to because this is the major problem. I mean, in terms of outdoor air pollution, whatever, that kind of thing, sometimes you talk to the government. At one time, they probably think, we really wanted to show that air quality improvement is a big achievement. At one time, they said, well, we wanted to focus on economy. If you see something about air pollution is, bad things about air pollution, at that time it's less welcome than another time, like, before the Olympics. They love to hear, that sort of thing. So very political, but, I don't know what to say, but I think it's someone who has very good political skills, very, very much needed, especially national interest is tied up with the tobacco industry and tied up with the oil, those are all national owned. And they don't want, I think at one point, if you really go to chase those emission sources, once that related to their tax income or whatever, they will start to put some resistance. So we're going to be a little bit clever.
But overall, but again, your studies, I mean, the fact that HEI is able to support these studies and that you're not being blocked, I mean, anything comments to say about this?
I mean, it's obvious that China, especially at certain times, can be very sensitive to public relations. The Olympics were a great example of that. I think, in some ways, and there's certainly issues of control of information. We've been very lucky in terms of getting unencumbered access to data, the ability to audit data with no challenges there. I think not unlike other places, it takes work, and you need to build trust, and that's why when we funded our studies, we insisted that the investigators have close ties to their EPBs and to their regulators, and so that there'd be an ability to have a relationship to access the data and to have a good trusting relationship among people doing the work. I think there's some concern when third parties and the World Bank or others, not that anyone's to blame here, but would go in and do a study that was perhaps done without a lot of Chinese involvement, and how did you get those numbers? And we would really like to look at those. And there's a request to engage a little bit more actively in that. And some of that's understandable, some of that's unfortunate. But I do think it takes work to engage and build trust to do the studies. And if you do that, by and large, we've had a good experience. Others haven't, but it's a mixed bag.
Okay, I have a question in the far back.
Yeah, Joshua Lipes from Radio Free Asia. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit. I mean, I think we know that the central government wants to put measures into place to combat air pollution, but can you talk about any disconnect at all between implementing these measures on the local level versus central?
That's a huge issue, I think, as I think is widely known, and all one has to do. I mean, MEP was elevated from SEPA, and in theory gained more stature. Not long ago, MEP had just 250 employees to regulate all of China, and EPA has no comment on EPA's staffing level, but they have many thousands of people to regulate in a country that is much cleaner to start with. So there's a huge, just sheer ability to cover the landscape issue with MEP. There's also the classic central government versus regional government issue in terms of exercising regulatory authority. And this is another one of the places where I think EPA has been able to productively engage, because while the issues are more challenging in China, there is a federal-state set of relationships in the United States. In the United States, there's a federal club. There's the ability to withhold federal highway funds if states don't comply with environmental mandates. In China, it's somewhat different that way. So bridging that gap is really quite challenging, and that calls, I think, for strengthening the infrastructure, but also to be reaching out to the provinces and to be sort of making the case there that there are issues.
Okay, and I guess we got one closer right up here. So it's got to be a really good question if it's the last one. Okay.
Donald Barnes from Guangxi University in Nanning, China. During my 6 years that I've been there, I've had the opportunity to be involved with some of the environmental work with the Meteorological Bureau and also with the EPB. And working with some Chinese colleagues on some of these studies, I found that, as Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. Well, in some ways, all environmental studies are local as well. And my Chinese colleagues had difficulty getting hold of some of the data, and they were basically had to pay for it. And there was a bidding situation. And then the issues of quality, I'd be very interested to talk with you afterwards about how you verify the quality, because that was a question that I had. So I know that EPA has done some good work in collaborative studies with the Chinese. How much work is there moving out beyond? For example, in Guangxi, where we are, that now is the new economic zone. It is going to be the major conduit between China and the ASEAN countries. They have already initiated moving away from the dollar as the economic mode of exchange to the RMB. So that part of China, which is in the West and has had one epidemiological study, according to your chart, it was a good one. It was a good one. is undergoing tremendous change. How much emphasis is there in that new part of China in your projections?
So they're going west with the development. Are they going west with environmental health studies, I guess, is part of the question.
Well, I guess it's, let me comment on the first part, which is the access to the data. Yes, that's not just, we are frustrated, but the local scientists who are, have the same kind of frustration, because now I think finally the department, meteorology, I don't know what the administration, whatever, that data becomes a little bit less a problem now. You pay them, with the. I don't think it's that expensive. At least you can get the data, but for environmental data like air pollution data, even you have money, if you wanted to get that data, it's very, very difficult. And I don't know why that is the reason, because that's make people always suspicious about what they're reporting. And, when we designed this study, the heart study, and, initial version is that maybe we can get those data, which our local, those high-profile scientists, they are involved in the Olympic organization committee. Those are very senior level people. They basically go into says, at the end, they says, if you want this data, someone at the premier or vice premier level has to sign this. Otherwise, there's no way you can get this. So I said, well, let's start our own monitoring. Yeah, we don't, we say we have to get a permit from the university president says, so it's okay to monitor all those kind of things. But that's for Olympics. Now, out of those time zones, if you do your own research monitoring site, that's okay. But if you want to get the data, still a big challenge. And one of my two of my longtime collaborators, they are, I don't know, the member of the People's Congress. So they also presented this at the Congress, try to say, we're going to have to do something because this is ridiculous. But again, little progress on that. The second part of your question about Guangxi and Gansu, other places, I think it's in the future maybe there will be some emphasis on that, but probably going to have a long lag time, 10 years or whatever. You're probably going to see some studies because historically we think that, those are less developed places, so still they're going to first focus on the economic growth, and then later I'll look at the environmental issues or what that's happening in the East Coast, all those more affluent provinces. 10 years ago, if you want to talk about air pollution or environmental pollution, even very toxic ones like what they call those electronic wastes, people doing that. We wanted just to go in to study some PCB exposures because those are people are just really, those are not you do molecular levels. Those are people you see they end up in the hospitals. No no access. They don't want to get anything, couldn't get any. I think, unfortunately, let's hope, the lessons we learned to push them a little bit so kind of avoid those kind of environmental disasters. But if I grew up in Gansu province. If I go to my hometown, if you talk about pollution, that kind of thing now, they are not going to want to talk about that now. They want to talk about economic development first. So,
yeah. But also, just to build on that, but I think on the East Coast, where there's a lot of studies, there's a lot more openness. But a lot of the pollution is moving to the West, just like you said. So, but okay, we're ending on kind of a gloomy note. But that's the topic. But I want to. Not totally. It is optimistic. I do want to, even though we're talking sad on the data, there is actually a lot of data online, somewhat skewed potentially, of air pollution monitoring stations in a lot of major cities. So there's data out there, but it's often very difficult to actually just get, and it sometimes disappears periodically, and so.
Air quality index.
Yeah,
air quality index.
That's our public.
Not the raw data. Yeah.
But you can back calculate out the concentrations from that. Actually, you can debate whether or not it's accurate, and there's definitely been evidence that there's been some fudging that goes on during. In Beijing, there was a paper that was published showing how, if you were close to that blue sky index, instead of having a nice sort of smooth curve around it, the values that came in just slightly below the index, there was like lots more of them than you would expect, and those that came in just above the index, there was way fewer of them than you would expect when you actually just plotted the air quality index that the Chinese government was reporting. But you can use them to calculate concentrations, and they're reasonably widely available, so it gives you some idea of what's going on.
All right. Well, can we first of all applause for the speakers? And as usual, I do have to thank my funders, USAID, Rockefeller Brother Fund, and you guys, because you sat here, listened very patiently. Good questions. You ask them more, tackle them. Not too long. I'm schlepping them off to the hill for a noon talk. But also want to remind folks that on May 20th, we're having a meeting called Animal Investigators. There's a book that came out. Do you know the Fish and Wildlife Service have this basically CSI for illegal wildlife trading? Cool. And we're going to have one of those, a special agent here as well. So it doesn't get better than that, the China Environment Forum. And, but also they're going to be talking about folks about, how they're working with China as well on these issues. Thank you very much, and see some of you on the 20th.